नमस्कार. ठाणे जिल्हा वकील संघटना आयोजित आजच्या 8व्या ऑनलाईन लेक्चर सीरीज मध्ये मी रुपाली शिंदे कमिटीच्या वतीने आपले सर्वांचे हार्दिक स्वागत करीत आहे. आजच्या लेक्चर संदर्भात आपल्याला अभय टिपसे साहेब मार्गदर्शन करणार आहेत. त्यापूर्वी दिनांक 11 मे पासून आपण जी ऑनलाईन लेक्चर सिरीजला सुरुवात केलेली आहे त्या संपूर्ण सिरीजना आपण सर्वांनी जो उत्तम प्रतिसाद दिलेला आहे त्याबद्दल मी कमिटीच्या वतीने आपले सर्वांचे आभार मानते. सुरुवातीला 11 मे रोजी राजेश मुदोळकर सरांनी आपल्याला फ्रीडम ऑफ स्पीच आणि त्याची क्रिमिनल लायबिलिटी यावर उत्तम मार्गदर्शन केले. सदरच्या लेक्चरला आम्हाला हजारोंच्या संख्येने व्ह्युअर्स मिळाले. त्यानंतर दिनांक 14 मे रोजी विजय आगाशे साहेबांनी ओव्हरव्ह्यूज ऑफ स्पेसिफिक रिलीफ ऍक्ट या विषयावर आपल्याला मार्गदर्शन केले. त्या लेक्चरला आम्हाला 5127 व्ह्युअर्स फेसबुकवर ज्यांनी मार्गदर्शन घेतलं गेलं. त्यानंतर दिनांक 17 मे रोजी आदरणीय गजानन चव्हाण सरांनी आपल्याला पोक्सो कायद्यातील तरतुदींबाबत मार्गदर्शन केले. सदरच्या लेक्चरला सुमारे 7787 व्ह्युअर्स नी मार्गदर्शन घेतलं. त्यानंतर दिनांक 20 मे रोजी ऍडव्होकेट युवराज नरवणकर सरांनी टेक्निकल ऍस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ डिजिटल एव्हिडन्स ऍक्ट संदर्भात 65B च्या अनुषंगाने अतिशय उत्तम प्रकारे सर्वांना मार्गदर्शन केलं. त्या लेक्चरला सुमारे 5000 व्ह्युअर्सनी हजेरी लावली. त्यानंतर दिनांक 23 मे रोजी कर्नाटक उच्च न्यायालयाचे मुख्य न्यायमूर्ती जस्टिस श्री अभय ओक साहेबांनी आपल्याला कोरोना नंतर जे रिफॉर्म्स करावे लागणार आहेत त्यावरती मार्गदर्शन केलं. सदरच्या लेक्चरला सुमारे 8765 व्ह्युअर्सनी साहेबांचं मार्गदर्शन घेतलं. त्यानंतर दिनांक 24 मे रोजी ऍडव्होकेट संदेश पाटील साहेबांनी फ्रस्ट्रेशन ऑफ कॉन्ट्रॅक्ट विथ रेफरन्स टू COVID-19 या विषयावर सर्वांना मार्गदर्शन केलं. त्यानंतर दिनांक 26 मे रोजी श्री शैलेश सडेकर साहेबांनी डाईंग डिक्लेरेशन अँड कन्फेशन या विषयावर सर्वांना मार्गदर्शन केलं. या सर्व लेक्चर्सना आतापर्यंत अतिशय उदंड असा प्रतिसाद आपण सर्वांनी दिल्यामुळे आम्ही सुरू केलेली लेक्चर सिरीज फळाला आली असं आम्हाला वाटतं. लॉकडाऊनच्या काळामध्ये आम्ही ठाण्यातील वकिलांसाठी तसेच महाराष्ट्रभर जे आपल्याला बघत आहेत त्या सर्वांसाठी काम करण्याची संधी आम्ही घेतली आहे आणि ती आम्ही पूर्णत्वाला नेत आहोत. सदरचं फेसबुकवरील व्ह्युअर्स आम्हाला अखंड महाराष्ट्रभर मिळाले असून महाराष्ट्रातील मुंबई, ठाणे, पुणे, नवी मुंबई, कल्याण, भिवंडी, नाशिक, पनवेल, औरंगाबाद व कोल्हापूर या शहरातील वकिलांचा समावेश आहे. तसेच ठाणे जिल्हा वकील संघटनेच्या वतीने आयोजित केलेल्या या 7ही लेक्चर सिरीजला भारताबाहेरील देशांमधून देखील अतिशय उत्तम प्रतिसाद मिळालेला आहे. त्यामध्ये युनायटेड स्टेट्स ऑफ अमेरिका, UAE, कतार, नाम्बिया, थायलंड, पोर्तुगाल, मॉरिशस या देशातील व्ह्युअर्सचा देखील समावेश आहे. या सर्वांचे मी आभार मानते की त्यांनी आम्ही सुरू केलेल्या लेक्चर्सना प्रतिसाद दिला. असं म्हणतात की कोणत्याही यशस्वी प्रयोगामागे कॅमेरा समोर येणाऱ्या व्यक्ती जितक्या महत्वाच्या असतात त्याही पेक्षा कॅमेरा मागे जे अखंड काम करत असतात त्यांचाही समावेश आहे. यामध्ये आमचे कमिटीचे सहसचिव श्री संदीप डोंगरे सर, विकास जोशी सर तसेच वारगडे सर यांचा देखील सिंहाचा वाटा आहे. लॉकडाऊन वाढेल किंवा नाही याबाबत आम्हाला आजपर्यंत माहिती उपलब्ध नाहीये. तरी देखील आम्ही ऑनलाईन लेक्चर सिरीज यानंतर देखील सुरू ठेवणार आहोत. 15 दिवसातून एकदा किंवा 8 दिवसातून एकदा अशा अंतराने आपण ऑनलाईन लेक्चर सुरू ठेवणार आहोत. तसेच कोर्ट सुरू झाल्यानंतर एकत्र न येणे वगैरे सोशल डिस्टन्सिंग हे आपल्याला पाळावंच लागणार आहे. त्या अनुषंगाने कोर्टात सुरू जे लेक्चर्स असायचे ते न घेता ऑनलाईन लेक्चर्स आपण कंटिन्यू करणार आहोत अध्यक्षांच्या परवानगीने. तसेच ह्या ऑनलाईन लेक्चरच्या माध्यमातून अखंड मार्गदर्शन सुरू ठेवण्याचा कमिटीचा मानस आहे. म्हणून आपण सर्वांनी अशाच प्रकारे आपला प्रतिसाद देणं सुरू ठेवावं आणि आपल्या ज्ञानामध्ये भर पाडावी. आपण सगळेच वकील आहोत, त्यामुळे सदरची ऑनलाईन लेक्चर सीरीज ही लॉच्या विषयांसंदर्भात डिस्कशन असं होऊ शकतं. त्यामुळे आपले काही प्रश्न, क्वेरीज, आपले काही प्रॉब्लेम्स कायद्याच्या संदर्भात असतील, तर आपण कृपया Facebookवर कमेंट बॉक्समध्ये, कमेंट सेक्शनमध्ये आपण कळवावं. त्याप्रमाणे कमिटी त्यावरती विचार करून त्याप्रमाणे लेक्चर्स अरेंजमेंट करण्याचा विचार करेल. आता मी आमचे अध्यक्ष अप्पा कदम सर यांना आजचे जे प्रमुख वक्ते आहेत अभय टिपसे साहेब यांच्याबद्दल माहिती देऊन कार्यक्रमाची सुरुवात करण्याची विनंती करते. धन्यवाद.
Good morning, friends. I welcome all to this session of online lecture series organized by Thana District Court Bar Association. I also welcome today's speaker, Honorable Justice Shri Abhay Tipse sir, a former judge of Bombay High Court, who will address us on the topic of glimpses of CRPC, different types of trials and pre-trial procedure. Now, let me turn to my job of introducing Justice Abhay Tipse sir. Abhay Tipse sir is a person who has made his work, made his mark in his society by his knowledge, integrity, and obviously by various judgments he delivered. Though no formal introduction is required, but I will highlight in brief some of his career details and achievements. Sir was born on the 10th March 1955. He was enrolled as an advocate in the year 1979. He practiced in various civil and criminal courts in Mumbai. He joined judicial services in the year 1987 as a metropolitan magistrate. Then he was transferred to Bombay City Civil and Session Court. He was thereafter appointed as judge of a special court under Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, where he handled various trials which were of complex and sensitive. He was then elevated to the Bombay High Court in March 2011. Later, he transferred to Allahabad in 2016, from where he got retired. Now, during his career, sir has presided over several high-profile cases, including Sohrabuddin encounter case and the Best Bakery case. The judgment of Best Bakery case, as we all know, reinforced the faith in the judiciary system. आता याच्यात सरांचं मी करिअर बद्दल सांगितलं. या व्यतिरिक्त एक सरांबद्दल महत्वाची माहिती म्हणजे ही इज अ रिमार्केबल चेस प्लेयर. He was awarded with the Dadaji Konde Award by the government of Maharashtra for his work as a chess coach. तर अशा व्यक्तिमत्वाचे आज पैलू असलेले आज जस्टिस अभय टिपसे सर आज आपल्या इथे आलेले आहे. मी सरांना विनंती करतो की या सेशनचा चार्ज घेऊन आपलं लेक्चर सुरू करावं. धन्यवाद.
धन्यवाद. व्यवस्थित ऐकू येतं ना? इट इज ऑडिबल ना? आवाज व्यवस्थित येतोय ना?
येस सर.
धन्यवाद. फक्त एक मला थोडीशी चूक दुरुस्त करायची वाटते. म्हणजे सोहराबुद्दीन एन्काउंटर केस आय हॅव नॉट हँडल्ड द ट्रायल आणि त्या केसशी संबंधित अशी काही बेल ऍप्लिकेशन्स माझ्याकडे मी हायकोर्टात असताना आली होती. एवढ्या मायनर करेक्शन नंतर आपण आता पुढे जाऊ. मला जी माहिती मिळाली या उपक्रमाबद्दल तुमच्या आणि इतक्या मोठ्या प्रमाणावर लोक अटेंड करतायत हे मी जेव्हा आमंत्रण स्वीकारलं तेव्हा मला माहित नव्हतं. पण खरोखरच म्हणजे आता मी फार त्यांनी प्रभावित झालेलो आहे. अर्थात मला काही विशेष वाटत नाही. ठाणा बार हा सर्वात मोठा आहे. ठाणा डिस्ट्रिक्ट ॲज अ ज्युडिशियल डिस्ट्रिक्ट ऑल्सो इट इज द बिगेस्ट वन इन महाराष्ट्र. आणि ठाण्याला सुद्धा जे डिस्ट्रिक्ट जज असतात ते फार सिनियर असतात. ठाणा बार पूर्वीपासून क्रिमिनल लॉ मध्ये त्यांचा खूप योगदान राहिलेलं आहे. अनेक मला ठाणा बार मधले असे वकील माहिती आहेत की जे फार प्रभाव त्यांनी टाकलेला क्रिमिनल प्रोसिडिंग वरती. आता आजचा शुड वी स्टार्ट नाउ? इट इज ऑडिबल अँड क्लिअर नो माय व्हॉइस?
Yes sir.
So we will start.
Yes, sir.
Now, today's topic is rather vast because CRPC, as you know, is very vast, and therefore it is not possible to touch every aspect of the CRPC in one, or for that matter, even in 10 or 12 lectures. But therefore, we have styled it as glimpses of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, before I start, I would like to make certain general observations. Now, all of you have studied CRPC as a subject in the college. You have passed examination in that subject. Then you have been practicing, and those who you have all studied that. Then you have experienced the working of CRPC because you appear in court as advocates, as prosecutors. Uh, so therefore, you are not unfamiliar to those provisions. Even then, I feel that there is a necessity. Yeah, shall I continue? Therefore,
please.
we will start with CRPC and our subject, that's of different trials and the various other aspects covered by the CRPC. We will have the study of Code of Criminal Procedure by referring to the important provisions. But as I said, we will try to go by topics and understand the principles underlying the topics on which the various provisions are based. That is the best way of understanding any law. And of course, one thing I want to say for the junior practitioners as well as the senior practitioners, and even for the judges, I tell the same thing, that whenever a problem of interpretation of a particular provision comes, you must read the provision first again. We all have repeatedly read those provisions, and therefore we hardly start from reading that provision. Instead, we rely on some recent case law. But that is not correct. Every time you read a provision from a particular angle, it will give you a new insight. This is my general advice. Now we'll go to the principles which are found in the Code of Criminal Procedure. The principal object of is the code, or any procedural law for that matter, is to provide for a fair trial. Means it should be a trial held by an independent and impartial tribunal with full equality to both the parties, full opportunity to both the parties to put forth their respective cases. This law, procedural law, has been evolved as a result of experience. It was realized that previously, that there were no such rules, and even that independent or impartial tribunal, that concept was not there. If you study olden times, some reported incidents or cases, we can call it, you will find that the judges, prosecutors, investigators, all were the same. A person will be proclaimed as guilty before the village, and then whatever sentence would be awarded to him will be executed by the same persons who make the allegations, who declare that he is guilty, who had previously arrested him. All that was resulting into grave miscarriage of justice. And as a result of that, a fair procedure was thought necessary. Now, to begin with, the Code of Criminal Procedure has got some peculiarities. Means it creates the criminal courts also. You are aware that civil courts are not created by the Code of Civil Procedure. Their origin is in some other enactments. But the Code of Criminal Procedure even creates the criminal courts of different classes. That we need not go deeper into that. You all know that the courts of judicial magistrate, then above that the court is of chief judicial magistrate, then additional session judge and assistant session judge also, they are a part of the court of sessions. And of course the constitutional courts, High Court and Supreme Court, they are also dealing with criminal matters. So in that sense, they are also criminal courts. So now these courts are created, and their powers, their sentencing powers, are also prescribed in the Code of Criminal Procedure. So this is one aspect of the Code of Criminal Procedure. I don't think that, like students, I should go into these aspects as to what are the powers and all that, because we have to skip that. Now comes the other part of that. The offenses are defined for the purposes of procedure to be followed. The offenses which are defined into various classes, classification of offenses, we can call it. So offenses can be classified in various different ways. The first and most significant is cognizable and non-cognizable. Now you must go through the definitions in the Code of Criminal Procedure very thoroughly. A cognizable offense is one for which a police officer can arrest without a warrant. And this arrest is according to the schedule appended to the Code of Criminal Procedure or any other law. There are many other laws which create offenses and which provide whether they are cognizable or not. So the cognizable offense is one for which a police can arrest without a warrant. And the significance of this we will see later. A non-cognizable offense is the offense for which the police officer has no authority or power to arrest without a warrant. Now, the other classification of the offenses is bailable and non-bailable. This is also important because in bailable offenses, bail is a matter of right, whereas in non-bailable offenses, the question of bail is a matter of discretion of the court. It is not that non-bailable bail cannot be granted, as you are aware, but it is the court can grant or refuse, whereas in case of bailable offenses, bail is a matter of right. Unfortunately, many times this right is also not asserted. And I have seen in bailable offenses, the courts have declined to grant bail because of not having realized this position or because of the failure of the advocates to insist that bail must be granted since the offense is made bailable by the legislature. The other classification of the offenses. So the other type of classification is compoundable and non-compoundable. Now, compoundable, of course, you know what is compoundable. The parties, the aggrieved person and the offender can permit settlement of the offense, so to say, and which is called compounding. Some offenses can be compounded as a matter of right, and some are compoundable with the permission of the court. Now, the classification of offenses is a matter of legislative policy. Certain offenses which are thought to be more primarily concerned as personal wrongs. Of course, all offenses are wrongs against the society, but there are some offenses which are predominantly of personal nature, and in such offenses, law in its wisdom has thought it permissible to permit the compounding of these offenses. Now, these are the classifications of offenses. Now we will come to the pre-trial procedures. Now, cognizable offense is one for which a police can arrest without a warrant. And as we said, the significance of cognizable offense is that a police officer, as a matter of right, is entitled to investigate into a cognizable offense. Means if the offense is classified as cognizable, then the police can forthwith start an investigation as soon as he knows the information or he knows about the commission of the offense or he suspects the commission of the offense. So I will first start with this powers of police of arrest and detention, because as soon as investigation starts, see, what is the object of the investigation? Investigation's object is to ascertain who is the offender, who has committed the offense, and then take steps for his arrest and for collection of evidence so that he can be tried before the competent court. Now, Section 41 is the important provision. It deals with the powers of police to arrest an offender. I will not read those provisions, but you all must be aware that these provisions have underwent a great change in the year 2005 and later in the year 2008. This change has been introduced by various judicial pronouncements taking a particular view. Legislature has accepted those views and recognized them by amending the provisions. I will only say that previously the arrest was quite easy. If there was a reasonable suspicion that a person has committed cognizable offense, the police officer was free to arrest a person. It was largely a matter of discretion of the police officer. Now that discretion has been curtailed to a great extent. you will find now a divide has been made between the offenses which are punishable for a period up to 7 years of imprisonment and the offenses which provide for a higher punishment. Now, as far as the offenses punishable under section, as far as the offenses punishable for imprisonment for a period of 7 years or less, arrest cannot be automatically done. In fact, there were a number of judgments of the Supreme Court, like Joginder Kumar's judgment, D.K. Basu's judgments. These are standard judgments found in the commentaries also, where they recognize that arrest is not a must. Just because the police have power to arrest, it is not necessary that they must arrest a person. They must see whether it is necessary. And of course, in today's small lecture, I can't discuss cases where I have found that a person was not touched till the charge sheet is filed, and the cases were actually the cases ended in convictions which were maintained by the higher courts also. From my experience, I can tell you that in many cases for collection of evidence, arrest is not essential at all. Particularly fraud, forgery cases, you can just imagine and think yourself whether any arrest is necessary at all in these type of cases. Anyway, that's a different part. So what we want to emphasize is that arrest is not mandatory just because a cognizable offense has been committed. And secondly, if the offense is punishable for imprisonment up to 7 years or less, then a police officer has to first give a notice of appearance to the person who is suspected to have committed the offense. And if he fails to appear, or if there are some other grounds, then only the arrest is justified. All this is elaborately dealt with in section 41. Section 41A speaks of notice of appearance. So this is the legislative trend where the powers of the police to effect arrest have been curtailed. Their discretion is curtailed. Not that discretion doesn't exist. Even now there is a discretion. But the discretion now has to have more objective basis, and the judicial consideration of the reasons is made mandatory, because the officer making or not making an arrest is required to record reasons for adopting the course which he has adopted. And these reasons therefore can be objectively viewed by the court. Now, I find that this policy of the legislature in making arrest difficult should be argued when you argue the bail applications, but hardly anybody has ever argued in support of bail applications whether the arrest in the first place was necessary at all. According to me, it may be a good point in many of the cases to point out at the first instance itself that arrest might not have been necessary at all. So there is a clear distinction between the offenses for which a maximum punishment of imprisonment of 7 years is there, and the offenses for which greater punishment is there. For the purposes of arrest, such distinction is recognized. So provisions of 41B, C, and D are also very important and should be thoroughly grasped. Now, incidentally, when we speak of a trial, we speak of a fair trial, and fairness starts from pre-trial procedures itself. If the pre-trial procedures are not fair, the subsequent trial may not be fair at all. And just I will make a mention of one aspect of the matter which I find that neither the advocates nor the judges, unfortunately it is more for the judges to pay attention, but the judges do not pay that much attention to this aspect, namely handcuffing of under trial prisoners. It is very common that police just handcuff the suspects and parade them to the court. They sometimes are taken by the street. This is totally contrary to the law laid down by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said that handcuffing of under trial prisoners cannot be done except in accordance with judicial orders. You can refer to some cases. The earliest case, I think, in that point of in that regard is Sunil Batra versus Delhi administration. You people have got access to the net and you can easily find these cases. That is 1978, 4 Supreme Court cases, page 494. Then Prem Shankar Shukla versus Delhi administration, that is 1980, 3 Supreme Court cases, 526. Batra's case, was decided by a bench of 5 judges. Prem Shankar Shukla's case was decided by a bench of 3 judges. And then there is a judgment of 1995 in the case of Citizens for Democracy versus State of Assam. This is, of course, by 2 judges of the Supreme Court. Now, all these judgments you must study. These judgments lay down or cast a duty upon the magistrate before whom an arrested person is produced to ask that arrested person whether he had been handcuffed by the police. I have seen that these provisions are not followed at all. When I was a district judge, I had made it mandatory in my district by bringing to the notice of the judicial officer all these 3 judgments. In fact, one judgment goes to the extent of showing that any lapse in that regard by a judicial officer will not be tolerated. But I have found from the records which I saw at the appellate level, High Court level, that though a normal routine question is asked whether you were assaulted or ill-treated by the police, a specific question whether he was handcuffed is never asked to the prisoner or the accused who is produced before the court. Why I emphasize so? Because all these points are connected with a concept of a trial, and trial has to be fair. When we speak of trial, we speak only of a fair trial. We want a fair procedure. And if a person is humiliated just at the point of time of his arrest, his confidence is shaken, then it is not likely that he will put up a strong resistance even if he is innocent. What effect, devastating effect, the concept of arrest, particularly when he is handcuffed and taken in streets, will have on the mind of a person can be imagined by you. There are many cases where the total life of the person is shattered because of such arrest, even though he was subsequently found not guilty. So as an advocate and as officers of the court, it is your duty to point out to the magistrate the violations of these rights of the accused made by the police when you seek some relief for the accused. Now, let us see other what are the pre-trial procedures and ensuring a fair trial. Now, Section 50 requires the accused to be told of the grounds of his arrest and intimation to be given to his friends and relatives. Section 50 makes it mandatory to inform the accused persons the ground of his arrest, and what is more important is his right to bail if the offense is bailable. I have never seen that this is in reality complied with by the police. That you have got a right to be released on bail is to be told to the accused if the offense is bailable, and this is mandatory. Now, this of telling him the grounds of his arrest is a recognition of the constitutional mandate contained in Article 22. Then Sections 53A and 54 provide for medical examination of the accused persons by a medical officer. And of course, the purpose is different. Section 53A requires the medical examination for the purpose of collecting evidence against an accused, but Section 54 is intended to protect the rights of the accused, to avoid any treatment of third-degree treatment, or if any, what we call it, if he is given a beating or if he is tortured in custody. Many times what happens, the police previously used to take a stand that these injuries were there already on the person of the accused when he was arrested. They used to give some story of mob beating and all that. To avoid that, the examination of the accused medically after his arrest has become necessary, and these provisions you can find in the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, Section 56 and 57 require the production of the accused before the inspector in charge of a police station or the magistrate. These are independent also. Section 56 speaks that if the arrest is made by a subordinate officer, first the accused is to be produced before the officer in charge of a police station. But what is more important is the provision of section 57, which says that an accused must be produced before the magistrate within a period of 24 hours from the time of his arrest. You all know these provisions, I am sure, but many times the police resort to making false entries to show a delayed arrest, and the courts, of course, should be vigilant to discourage such practices, and as advocates it should be your duty to point out to the court such wrong practices if they are being practiced by the police. Now let us see what are the other pre-trial rights of the accused, like what rights the accused can have. We will, while referring to different provisions, we will see that I can tell you some case law which may be of some interest to you in the context of these articles, these sections 50 and Article 22 of the Constitution. That is, one is Pranav Chatterjee versus State of Bihar. That is 1973 Supreme Court cases 926. There the court held that provisions of section 50 are mandatory. Then production before the magistrate or judge immediately. I don't think there is any necessity of referring to any case law because there are hundreds of them, and these are very clear provisions in the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, sometimes you can ask for compensation for unlawful arrest and detention. In that case, Nilabati Behra versus State of Orissa, you may note this case, 1993, two Supreme Court cases, 746. There, the Supreme Court provided for compensation to persons groundly arrested because the CRPC recognizes, section 358 recognizes the compensation to persons groundly arrested, but that provides for a small compensation, and a person is not precluded from bringing the matter before the higher courts or file a civil suit against the state to recover such compensation. Now, after the arrest, then next comes the stage of search and seizure. Now, search and seizure is an important aspect of the investigation. No doubt the police are required to take search and all that. But you all must know that the police can't force a person to incriminate himself. They can't use third-degree methods. They can't torture a person for the purpose of eliciting information, and all these provisions you will find in the Constitution itself, which are recognized duly in the Code of Criminal Procedure also. Now, what happens? The provisions of search. First of all, the police have been given the power to search. So, search by itself cannot be objected if the other conditions are fulfilled. But the powers of search are governed by the provisions of section 165 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, where the search is to be taken in the presence of two respectable persons from the locality. That is, the police draw a panchanama and record the seizure. So these are the safeguards which are provided, and if these safeguards are violated, the evidence about such search may be very doubtful. Let me tell you one thing. In our country or our law, we don't hold that the evidence obtained or article recovered pursuant an illegal search by itself as exonerating an accused. At the most, it will vitiate the evidence of the search. It will require the court to look at it with suspicion. But any illegality in the investigation by itself will not result in acquittal of an accused during the trial. It all depends on ultimately whether prejudice was caused to an accused because of that illegality. Of course, there are some special provisions, special enactments like NDPS, where it has been held that breach of that certain mandatory provisions, section 50 of the NDPS, will result in vitiating the search and by itself will result into an acquittal of the accused if he is being prosecuted on the basis of the recovery of a contraband from his person. So that is one aspect which you need to keep in mind, that illegality in investigation by itself will not vitiate the trial procedure. Now we'll come to the trial procedures. A trial, what is a trial, has not been defined in the Code of Criminal Procedure. You will find that though everybody knows what is trial, nobody has attempted to define it. But it has been held by judicial pronouncements that a trial commences when a charge is framed or particulars of offense are explained to the accused. Before that, the proceedings can be investigation when the police are doing it, and if the court is doing it, is termed as inquiry, but it is not a trial. Investigation and inquiry, these terms have been defined in the code, that is section 2H and 2G, and as I said, you must thoroughly master the definitions of these. Not because you have to write it in any paper, you have all done that. You have studied the law, you are a practicing advocate, but the concept sometimes may be very useful in your arguments. Particularly at appellate stage, various complex questions of law are raised, and therefore your fundamentals in this regard as to what is a trial, what is an inquiry, what is investigation, what is their character, are they judicial proceedings, that these concepts should be very clear, and therefore you must thoroughly grasp this proceeding. Investigation, of course, is not a judicial proceedings. It is done by the police. Now, offenses are classified in various different ways, which we saw. Like that, the code has made a distinction in the types of trial depending on the gravity or seriousness or type of the offenses. You know, summons cases and warrant cases. These are two primary distinctions made. Then distinctions also arise because the source of approaching a court is not only one. Means it is not that only the police will file a charge sheet in the court. An aggrieved person can file a complaint, or anybody for that matter can file a complaint directly before the magistrate also. So those cases will be on the basis of complaints. Complaint has been defined in section 2D of the code as any allegation made orally or in writing to a magistrate with a view to his taking action under the code, that some person, whether known or unknown, has committed an offense punishable under the code. Now, many times I have seen that when a prisoner makes a complaint of ill treatment or something, the courts have said that file a complaint, make a complaint in writing. It is not necessary, because complaint can be made orally. It is the duty of the magistrate to record it if it is made orally, and therefore this needs to be known and argued in appropriate cases that this itself is a complaint and this may be recorded, and appropriate action in accordance with law be taken. These then the cases will be of these type: cases instituted on police report, cases instituted on complaints, then cases in respect of offenses which are summons triable, cases in respect of offenses which are warrant triable, which are summons cases and warrant cases. Then some offenses are triable by the Court of Sessions. They are of a more serious nature usually. As you have seen, the powers of various courts to award sentences differ. Punishment prescribed for different offenses differ. And accordingly, as a matter of legislative policy, though not only on the basis of sentencing, but as a matter of legislative policy, it has been laid down which court will try which offense. And that you find in the schedule, first schedule to the Code of Criminal Procedure. If any offenses are committed in any other laws other than IPCs, as we see, there are many such acts which create different offenses, then those acts provide by which court the offense will be tried. Like NDPS, the offenses under the NDPS Act, special courts are constituted under the same provisions of the same act. Then, under the MCOC, Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, there is also a special court. For Prevention of Corruption Act, special courts are constituted by the provisions of those acts only. So all these trials, there will be some variation depending on which court is trying the accused, what is the nature of the offense, and in what manner it has been taken to the court. Now, before we actually go to the trial procedures, which are more or less similar, and we can just notice the broad features, we will see what happens after the arrest. If you study the provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure, you will realize that basically what is expected is that the investigation should be over within 24 hours. And that is why the 24 hours period is provided. But what happens? Usually it is never over in 24 hours. So what happens? When 24 hours it is not over, the police cannot detain. They have no powers to detain further, as we have seen. So they take the arrested person to the magistrate and seek his remand in custody. That means remand means authorization of further detention. It is popularly called as remand. If it is in police custody, the remand word is more appropriate. But even if a person is taken in judicial custody and sent to prison, even then this is termed as a remand only. So that nomenclature is not important, but what we need is that further detention needs to be authorized by the magistrate. So the magistrate in that regard is required to satisfy himself, firstly, that the allegation is well founded. Remember, there is nothing which prevents the magistrate from discharging an accused right now, right at the first stage when he is produced before him. There is no such thing that he must remand or he must release only on bail. Undoubtedly, he can give bail. Bail provisions we'll see separately because they are quite important, and we'll make a reference to them undoubtedly as a topic under the code itself. But he can not only release him on bail, but also discharge him outright if there are no grounds at all. And such powers are sometimes exercised, not that they are never exercised. If the allegation is palpably false or absurd, nothing prevents the magistrate from discharging. In this context, I would like to impress upon you the scheme of the provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure, where the magistrate plays a significant role. Why I am saying so? Because if you understand this, then you will understand the meaning of many provisions, and you will be able to put a better performance. See, the magistrate is at the helm of the affairs, of the investigation. You will notice that in code, the provisions are so designed that every action of the police is kept under the check or control of the magistrate in an indirect way. No doubt the magistrate cannot control the investigation. He cannot force the police to form a particular opinion. For that, you can see Abhinandan Jha's case. Abhinandan Jha, that is the citation you will be able to find out, but it's a very famous case. Abhinandan Jha, that ultimate decision is of the court whether a person should be put to trial or not. But the court at the same time cannot force the police to form an opinion. The scheme of investigation requires that after investigation, the police will form an opinion whether he has committed the offense or not, and send him for trial. That formation of opinion by the police is not binding on the magistrate. So I am saying this totally in a different context, to show how the magistrate has powers to keep the investigation under control and how the provisions are designed. We have seen that police can arrest a person, but can they discharge? No, police cannot discharge a person, because otherwise there will be no check. They will arrest at their sweet will and discharge at their sweet will. That is not so. For discharging, they must go before a magistrate who alone has got a power to discharge an accused. Under section 58, there is a special power to the magistrate to discharge. Now the police can seize the property in the search we have seen, but can they return? No, they can't return. For return of property, there is a separate chapter in the Code of Criminal Procedure where the powers are with the magistrate or court only. So the police can seize the property but can't return it. Police can arrest a person but can't discharge them. So these provisions show the importance of magistrate and what the law expects from the magistrate. And it is your duty to point out to the magistrate that what is expected of them, not merely endorsing the action of the police, but applying their own independent mind. And in every criminal trial, it is the function of the criminal court to see that the rights of the citizens are not violated by the state. The rights are protected. And therefore, every violation of the right, every procedure of irregularity of the police, if noticed by the court, must be promptly dealt with, and if it is serious, serious consequences should follow. Now, Abhinandan Jha's case, I will give you a citation because that I think you must study the case. AIR 1968, Supreme Court 117. It's a very important case. You must study that. Now we'll come back after discussing the powers of, we'll come back to the stage of investigation. Now, the magistrate from time to time remand an accused in police custody or in judicial custody. The police custody, the maximum remand possible is 15 days, maximum 15 days. Beyond that, if detention is to be authorized, it is only in judicial custody. In that regard, of course, you must be knowing by the practice of the court, and since you have the experience, what one has to understand is this. Sometimes some arguments are made, like there was a case where suppose initially an accused person is remanded into police custody for 7 days, and then he is remanded into judicial custody. Request used to be made by police that our 7 days or 8 days are still balanced, and now give to us, after he has already spent some 15 days in judicial custody, give back to us for 7-8 days, and some courts had obliged. So in Anupam Kulkarni's case, Supreme Court has clarified that the police custody remand has to be ordered for maximum 15 days, and this maximum 15 days means it's within the first 15 days only. You can't say that 10 days he is in judicial custody, then another 10 days. Let us take an example so that there is no ambiguity. Suppose a person is in police custody for 10 days. He is remanded in police custody, and he could be remanded for 5 more days, but instead of that, he is remanded into police custody, judicial custody, say for 15 days. Then after 15 days, the police say that our 5 days custody is balanced, so give us in police custody. That cannot be done, because he is already in custody for 25 days, and whatever detention in police custody can be authorized, that will be only under the first 15 days. Of course, I must tell you that there are special provisions in MCOC Act or in some enactment where this transfer of custody is permitted, but that will be applicable only to cases under that act, and retention by the police. Yes. Now, but there is a limit on the judicial power of detention also. You know that this detention pending investigation cannot be for an indefinite time, because the police may take even years, not months, years to file a charge sheet. They will say investigation is going on. So that is not permissible. Depending on the type of offense, the offenses which are punishable with 10 years, imprisonment for life, or death, there the maximum period for detention pending investigation can be 90 days. In case of other offenses, the maximum period will be 60 days. Now, after that, what happens? Suppose this 60 days period is over and 90 days period is over, whatever is applicable to that offense, and the investigation is still incomplete, charge sheet is not filed. Then what happens? Then accused is mandatorily to be released on bail. Unfortunately, I have seen cases where detention is authorized beyond that under some pretext. Accused is not produced, issue notice to accused. All this is not necessary. It is peremptorily worded, the provision: no magistrate shall authorize the detention of an accused beyond the period stipulated therein. That is proviso to section 167. So there is no question of any application also by the accused. There is some case law where it has been held that accused must apply necessarily, but they are relating to special offenses like TADA, POTA, where there was a provision of extension of time on prosecution's application. The time could be extended by the court. In the ordinary course, for an ordinary offense, the wording is very clear that no magistrate can authorize detention. In fact, I have seen magistrates when I was practicing, but later on I have seen that this is not being done. They used to see that the date of arrest, when he is produced for remand beyond 90 days, they won't remand at all. Today, what happens? I have seen cases where mechanically remand orders are passed. Then he is in custody on that day, he is not produced. And how will he make an application before the court for getting released? So you must understand that This is a statutory right of the accused to be released on bail. Beyond that, he can't be remanded, and he has to be released on bail. Of course, if he doesn't produce the surety or doesn't execute the bond, then of course he will be detained. But that doesn't mean that bail order is not to be passed. Bail order is to be passed. Now, one difficulty which sometimes people ask me is that whether a person who has committed very serious offenses, if suppose he is released, as this release is mandatory, suppose he has committed 4 murders, there is strong evidence, but charge sheet is not coming. Of course, he will have to be released. Many times, even the advocates have shown ignorance of that it is a mandatory release. They must, the court has no option but to release him on bail. But the difficulty comes later on. What happens if subsequently charge sheet is filed and the offense is serious? Whether the bail gets cancelled on filing of charge sheet? No. Because section 167 says that the person released on bail under that provision is deemed to have been released on bail under the provisions relating to bail under section 437 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. So the bail will remain in force even after the subsequent, even if subsequently charge sheet is filed. The bail granted on default, which is called as default bail, bail granted on default, commonly it is called as in default of filing a charge sheet, that does not get automatically cancelled because a person is released on bail in a regular manner. It is deemed to be a regular bail. Of course, like bail granted can be cancelled for certain grounds, for certain reasons, and in certain circumstances. Those grounds will be available, but the prosecution has to seek cancellation of bail by making an appropriate application and make out grounds which will justify cancellation of bail, and then only cancellation of such bail is permissible. So it is after the conclusion of investigation that the police file a final report before the magistrate. Now we have seen that when they say that the accused has committed offense and there is evidence and he should be tried, that is popularly called a charge sheet, that report. For the purposes of CRPC and as a matter of law, all the reports are police reports only. Police report as defined under section, as contemplated under section 173 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. So that report is a final report, and such a report is must. Every investigation commenced must end with that report only. But that report can be of any type. It's not that it has to be a charge sheet. It has to be a final report in the sense it may say that the complaint is found to be false or that there is no evidence against the accused. All these, as we said, are final reports. Term charge sheet has become popular because it has been used in police manuals. The Evidence Act doesn't, the Code of Criminal Procedure or Evidence Act or IPC, of course, there is no question of using these terms. But CRPC nowhere uses this term. But it has become so popular that you will find it being used in the judgments of the courts also. Popularly, it means a police report in which a conclusion has been arrived at by the police that an offense has been committed and the person who is made an accused has done that offense and there is sufficient evidence to prosecute him. Then such a report is called a charge sheet. As I said earlier, this opinion is not binding on the magistrate. Even the final report is not binding on the magistrate. Final report which says that no offense is disclosed, that is also not binding on the magistrate. And one important provision in this regard, I will point out with reference to the case law. See, suppose a person lodges a report against, say A lodges against X, that X has committed so and so offense. And the police investigate, X is arrested, remanded, and police ultimately come to the conclusion that X has not committed any offense or the complaint of A is false or as a result of misunderstanding. Now they will submit the report. Naturally, it is for the magistrate to accept or reject that report. He may reject it also and proceed against X also on the basis of the same papers, because his opinion may be different, though the material may be same. His opinion may be different from that of the police. But there is no direct provision in the Code of Criminal Procedure as to whether the first informant needed to be heard in that matter. But the Supreme Court has laid down that in such a case, it must be it is necessary for the court to issue a notice to the first informant. Means the proposition is like this, that whenever the police decide not to take any action against a person at whatever stage, either initial stage or after the conclusion of the investigation, who has been named as an accused in the FIR, then the police must give notice to the first informant. If the police have not given, the court has to give. And you know that this practice has been followed in the court, though there is no express provision in the Code of Criminal Procedure. This is Bhagwat Singh versus Commissioner of Police, Delhi, AIR 1985. Page number I can't cite right now, but you can easily find out this case. This is very famous case. Now, pursuant to these judgments, the courts in this country have been issuing notices to the first informant, where the police file a report that no case is made out. Of course, such report or such notice is necessary only where the first informant has named a person in the first information report and still the police don't take any action against him. One thing which needs to be remembered is also this, that only the first informant is entitled to the notice, not the victim. Sometimes the victim may be different and the first informant may be different. So victim is not entitled to notice under this provision. There is some confusion observed by me in various orders or arguments, and that is why I have elaborated this. Now a charge sheet is filed and the magistrate thinks that there is ground for proceeding, and then a trial starts. Similarly, the other way of approaching the magistrate is by filing a complaint, which can be in cognizable offences also. And in case of non-cognizable offences, usually you have no other option, because the police can't investigate without an order of the magistrate, and the complainants therefore prefer to go to the magistrate in case of non-cognizable offences and file complaint if they want to have their grievances redressed. So these are complaint cases, which may be of non-cognizable offences as well as cognizable offences, where the magistrate examines a complainant on oath, and if there are sufficient grounds for proceeding, this takes a very prima facie limited view of the matter, then he issues summons or warrant, which is called process, to the accused. He can also order investigation if he is not sure as to whether process is to be issued or not. And this investigation will be under the provisions of section 202 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. If the complaint is made to a court or magistrate not having jurisdiction, he can't dismiss it. He has to return it to the complainant for filing it before the proper court. That is section 201 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now, when process is issued, the proceedings before the magistrate will start on a complaint. Of course, if there is no substance in the complaint, then the magistrate can dismiss the complaint under section 203 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Now we proceed towards the stage of trial. Now the case is laid before the court, either by way of a complaint or by way of charge sheet, that is police report. CRPC uses police report, and it is better that we stick to that word. Cases instituted on police report and cases instituted or otherwise than on police report. So which are mostly complaint cases. There may be a rare class of cases where the case is instituted on the magistrate's own knowledge, because section 190C permits section 190 permits cognizance to be taken on the basis of the magistrate's own knowledge also. Of course, there will be a different procedure. He may have to send it to another magistrate, etc. But that we are not concerned for the time being. So this is the way the trial starts. Now, in complaint cases, there will be two types of cases, two types of procedures. That is a summons case and warrant case. Now, in summons cases, what is the difference in trial of summons cases and warrant cases? Either instituted on the basis of a police report or on the basis of complaint, we may see. See, in warrant cases, a charge is to be framed. Framing of charge is governed by different provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure. We can't meticulously go into that, but there are provisions for framing of charge. Whereas in summons cases, it is not necessary to frame a formal charge. It is the court is required only to explain the particulars of the offense to the accused, and then the plea of the accused is recorded, which is common to both. I will deal with the differences only. The third type of trial is trial before a court of sessions, which again may be based on a complaint and or a charge sheet. Now, if charge sheet has to be filed before the magistrate only in the first instance, but if the offense is triable by the magistrate, triable by the sessions court, the magistrate finds that he can't try it, it's triable by session court, then he has to commit the case to the court of sessions. In coming to this conclusion, he has to go by the record of the case only. He can't take any evidence to decide that. Now, trial before the court of sessions also proceeds more or less in the same way. First, the accused is asked whether he is guilty or not. If he pleads guilty, the court has got a discretion to convict him on that plea. Remember, discretion only. The court can outright reject the plea, even if an accused pleads guilty. It is not obligatory on the part of the court to convict him, because that is the policy of the law, not to base a conviction or prove guilt of an accused on the basis of information coming from the accused himself. And that is why many confessions are inadmissible. Many times the plea can be motivated. It can be, the person can be under pressure, and the court has to apply its mind. In sessions cases, it is very uncommon to act on a plea of guilty. But in some minor offenses, of course, if he pleads guilty, the magistrate has got full discretion to convict him. If the plea is not accepted or the accused pleads not guilty, then summonses to prosecution witnesses are issued. They are examined, cross-examined. After that, the accused is questioned about the evidence that appears against him. I will just go to some basic provisions in that regard, instead of dealing with different types of trials in detail. These are very simple chapters: trial of summons cases, trial of warrant cases. What is necessary to be emphasized is that the pre-trial procedure requires that copies of the charge sheet must be furnished to the accused before framing charge, and he must be heard on that. In complaint cases which are warrant triable, evidence before charge is to be adduced, and it is only if that evidence is sufficient then a charge is framed. Otherwise, the court can discharge him. There will be some provisions which I will deal with just briefly. That is, one, the tender of pardon to accomplice. These are sometimes used when there is no evidence to prove the guilt of an accused independently, and somebody who has participated in that crime needs to be taken into confidence and brought as a witness, and therefore this provision is there. I will only highlight one thing, that the police have no power to grant pardon. Remember, it is only the court that can grant pardon to an accused, and in the circumstances mentioned in sections 306, 307 and 307(8) of the IPC. Now, I will draw the attention to certain important provisions which lay down important principles. One is power to examine the accused under section 313 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Everybody knows, you all know that. Now, this power is not taken seriously either by the accused or by the court, or sometimes both the court, accused, prosecutor, all the parties concerned are not very particular about this. I find that proper questions are many times not asked to the accused person. Actually, this is a very important provision, and as advocates, for the defense or even as prosecutors, you should be very diligent and suggest to the court what questions should be asked. See, the provision is designed to give an opportunity to the accused to give his explanation in his own words of the evidence that is presented against him during the trial. This is not to be substituted by the answers given by his lawyer. Accused personally has to explain this, and the provision is designed to give him an opportunity. Now, this accused is not liable for any punishment if he refuses to give the answers. Means, in other words, he is not obliged to give the answers because the provision is for his benefit. Questions with the object of trapping the accused cannot be asked to him, like questions asked in the cross examination, they can't be asked. Then any circumstance of importance, if it is not put to the accused, it may vitiate the trial, and the courts have taken a view that it may, under certain circumstances, vitiate the trial itself, but that's a very serious irregularity. There are, number of misconceptions about these provisions of section 313, that accused has to say just no. It of course, accused is entitled to say that, but sometimes a plausible explanation of certain question will tilt the balance of the case, and mean the court may accept that, because you know that guilt has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, and if any doubt arises, the benefit of that should go to the accused. In the absence of some explanation, sometimes the court may not have such doubt, but if an explanation is offered, a doubt can legitimately be created. So this 313 is a very important provision under the code. Now, I think we are losing sight of many provisions because a lot of time will be spent in that. Another provision I will just touch, section 315, that accused person to be a competent witness. This is an important provision because it lays down, among other things, that he cannot be called as a witness except on his own request made in writing. Even if his advocate says that is not sufficient. So this shows the policy of law, that it should be a well thought of decision. And there is one important thing, that the failure of the accused to examine himself shall not be adversely commented upon by the court or by the prosecutor. And this sometimes I have seen in judgments also, that the accused did not examine himself, has been criticized in the judgment, and thereby suggesting that he had no case on merits. This is totally wrong, and there are decisions of the Supreme Court which say that this cannot be done. You can just search for such judgments and you will find out a number of them. I will now come to the aspect of bail, because we have very limited time, and probably we have overrun the time, because I want some time to be given for question and answers also. And there is so much case law that you can't just keep on analyzing the case law. I tried to analyze the provisions of CRPC which I thought to be of more relevance. Now, bail. Bail is a very important provision from the practical point of view. As soon as an accused is arrested and detained in custody, the first application which comes from him is for bail. As practitioners in criminal law, you also know that the clients approach you for making bail, because the immediate concern is to get the person who is arrested by the police. Now, what is the meaning of the term bail has not been mentioned in the Code of Criminal Procedure. In fact, the term does not appear to have been used in a very uniform way in the Code of Criminal Procedure. Sometimes the word bail is used, sometimes bond with sureties is used. So it is not defined anywhere in the code, but it is traditionally it has acquired meaning. See, bail is the release of a person pending trial on his assurance that he will attend the trial whenever required, and he will abide by the conditions that will be imposed by the court, which are usually to the effect that not to threaten or tamper with the witnesses, etc., not to change the address, not to depart from the jurisdiction of the court, etc. So this is the concept of bail. Usually it is, of course, you know that it is to be taken in a monetary way. Some sum is fixed and the person has to say that if I don't attend the court, that sum will be forfeited. A person is asked to find out one or more sureties as a guarantor, because his own guarantee may not be sufficient, and if he is not found, from whom the money is to be recovered. So this is the concept of bail. Now, this is governed by the provisions of 436, 436A, 437, 437A. Then anticipatory bail is 438 and 439. Anticipatory bail will keep aside for the time being. Now, 436 deals with bailable offenses, and of course, you know that a person has to be released on bail. Bail order has to be passed. He will remain in custody only if he cannot furnish the surety. Now, 436A was later on added to the Code of Criminal Procedure because it was found that a large number of indigent persons were languishing in custody because they could not furnish sureties, though bail orders had been passed in their favor. So 436 actually deals with two aspects. It says that if he is unable to find surety, you can release him on personal bond. Secondly, if a person has undergone half of the term of imprisonment provided for that offense, then he should be released on bail, subject, of course, if there are special reasons, court may not release. In 437, the non-bailable offenses, the court has got a discretion, but the discretion is curtailed in the case of offenses which are punishable with death or imprisonment for life. But again, the discretion is restored if the arrested person is a woman or a sick or infirm person or a person below 16 years of age. Now that 16 years has lost significance because now they will be governed by the provisions of the Juvenile Justice Act and are not ordinarily expected to be produced before the magistrate. 437 deals with bail by courts other than the High Court and Sessions Court, which are usually the magistrate courts or some courts under the special enactments, which though are presided by the judges of the level of session judges, are not session courts by themselves, and therefore they will go by the provisions of section 437. Now 437 subsection 6 and 7 are very important. Subsection 6 applies to cases where the trial has not completed within 2 months from the first date fixed for taking of evidence. So in magistrates court, if the trial has not been concluded within a period of 2 months from the date first fixed for evidence, a person should ordinarily be released on bail. Of course, the discretion is maintained for reasons to be recorded, but this should be very extraordinary ground. I mention this provision because many practitioners or even judges have not given a thought to this provision. Very rarely applications are moved under this provision, though it is applicable to so many cases in the magistrate courts. The date is fixed for fixing evidence, 2 months trial is not over, person should be released on bail. Then of course subsection 7 is there where a person can be released on bail. Many times what happens, the trial is over, the court makes up its mind that a person, there is no case of conviction, but there is no time to write judgment, so the court can release him on personal bond. Courts can frequently use this provision. They can be asked or requested to do so. Now you will find that I don't want to go very deeper because we will be extending the time too much. See, these provisions of section 437 lays down that if the offenses are punishable with more than 7 years, punishment of imprisonment for more than 7 years, then the court shall not pass an order without hearing the prosecutor. In other words, it means that in other cases, it is not obligatory for the court to hear the public prosecutor. Public prosecutor should be heard, that is my opinion also, because opportunity should be given. But when we see cases where repeated adjournments are being given to hear the public prosecutor and the bail application is, then one has to point out that it is not necessary to wait for the the public prosecutor and to detain the accused because of lapses on their part or because they can't remain present. Many times the accused are not produced from judicial custody because police guards are not available, these excuses are given, and the courts, I have seen, deferring the hearing of the bail applications on that ground. How can they do that? It's not necessary that he has to be present before the court physically to decide his bail application. That's not necessary at all, and in fact that should be taken as a ground for granting bail rather than deferring the hearing of the bail application. Now, section 439, of course, the powers of the High Court and Session Court, there are no fetters on their powers, like uh, if the offense is punishable with death or imprisonment for life, then he should not be released on bail if there are reasonable grounds to believe that he has committed the offense, like we saw in 437. But still, the courts follow, by and large. The courts are more careful in granting bail where there is a prima facie case of a serious offense which is punishable with death or imprisonment for life. Then the courts have power to cancel the bail. 439(2), the High Court and Session Court can cancel the bail. Similarly, under 437(5), the magistrate or the courts other than the High Court and Session Court who have granted a bail to an accused person, they can cancel the bail. The parameters for cancellation of bail are, however, different. And unless the bail order has been obtained fraudulently, such as by deceiving the court, that is by giving some false documents or absolutely false information, then only it can be cancelled. Otherwise, by and large, it has to be decided on the basis of supervening circumstances, means something which the accused has done after he is released on bail, like he has abused his liberty, either he has not remained present before the court, or he has threatened a witness, or he has committed some other offenses. Like that, such solid grounds are generally expected before a bail, once granted by a court, is cancelled. Even Supreme Court has said in Bhagir Jadeja's case that cancellation of bail is to be viewed differently from granting bail, and assuming the court might not have granted bail in the first instance, but if it is granted, then for cancellation, some solid and better grounds are required rather than mere existence of a prima facie case. From practical point of view, I would tell you, many times it is said that a prima facie case is there and therefore I don't grant bail. It will be your duty to argue that existence of prima facie case is no bar to grant bail. In fact, question of bail seriously arises when there is a prima facie case. Otherwise, an accused gets discharged. If there is no prima facie case, one would be discharged. And there are Supreme Court decisions that Justice Krishna Iyer has said in number of judgments that prima facie case is there is no ground to refuse bail. If prima facie case is not there, then that is the end of the matter and you may grant bail without going further. But prima facie case is there doesn't mean that you must refuse to grant bail. What it means that then you examine the matter further, whether bail should be granted or not. So this is one argument which I often see, or from the orders of the lower courts I have seen, that there is a prima facie case, hence bail rejected. That is not a sound order in my opinion. Prima facie case is not there, then bail has to be granted, no doubt. But prima facie case is there, then the matter has to be examined and there has to be other grounds which if the court thinks that on those grounds bail should not be granted, then that's correct. I think because we have had enough discussion and I would like to have more time for general discussions, because this is a topic which is unending. There are so many provisions in Code of Criminal Procedure, different provisions on different topics and of great importance, like section 311, power to recall a witness. Then of course 319, power to proceed against persons who are not named as accused. Like suppose a thief is being tried on the charge of theft, and this has happened, I have seen it happening. Usually in such cases, there is a recovery by the police under section 27, recovery of stolen property from a receiver sometimes, and the receiver is examined. And you know that receiving stolen property is also an offense under section 411. Many times it appears from the record that he has received it for nominal price, or a wristwatch of 10,000 he has purchased for 500 rupees. In that case, obviously he had reason to believe that it was stolen property, and nothing prevents the court from proceeding against the receiver in such cases. And then of course there are provisions that the witnesses will have to be reheard. Trial, so far as the person newly added accused is concerned, it will commence afresh, etc. So all these provisions we can't discuss in one lecture because it's a very vast subject. I think we should stop here, because I believe that I have dealt with the aspects which I thought to be important, and now whatever questions or topics which the participants wish to bring before, they should have enough time, and therefore we'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, any questions? Please raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yes, please continue.
Sir, good afternoon. This is Sagar Kolle here from Thane Court. My question is
Yes.
that after amendment in section 353 of IPC by Maharashtra
Yes.
government, all
Yes, yes.
cases are pending before the magistrate, all cases transferred to the session court. Sir, as per the Article 21, subclause 1, which is not
Yes.
unconstitutional because
See,
punishment is
Yeah.
increased up to 5 years.
No, but when he committed the offense, what was the date? Means it was it before amendment or after the amendment?
Before amendment, sir.
Then he cannot be subjected to a greater punishment. That is certain. That is 100%
But
correct.
cases are transferred to the session court.
Is it made triable by that amendment? Triable by sessions court?
Tribal by session court.
See, I will tell you, because this I have not examined at any time, but I will tell you the law very accurately. See, these amendments, they cannot have retrospective effect. And there is a constitutional guarantee, even otherwise. Because if you cannot be subjected to a greater penalty, then that could have been imposed at the time when you committed the offense. What was the penalty prescribed for that? No one can impose a higher penalty by subsequent amendment. However,
Okay.
the provisions which are purely procedural, because today if you have to apply by which court it is to be tried, it is not retrospective application. Today you have to decide by which court it is triable.
Okay.
Then of course you have to go by the present position, because that cannot be called as retrospective application. It is not retrospective. But as far as this amendment is concerned, your question is very complex, because I have got very serious doubts about the validity of this amendment. You are talking about the same amendment, no, which says that even 156(3) order also without sanction you can't pass an order and all that.
No, sir. 353.
Only that is separately made.
IPC. Yes, sir. That is separately.
Just can you
2019 something, sir.
but can you just show that how it is made triable by the Court of Session? You can just read over the amendment. We'll finish this subject.
Wait, sir.
Where is the amendment to that 2019 to 353 IPC? Because I have not dealt with this amendment.
Amendment made in, sir, 2018. And thereafter, one judgment has been given by, I think, Nagpur bench. So
I
this
see.
is the procedure amendment something. So procedure amendment can be retrospectively effect.
No, that I told you, because actually it is not retrospective also, because you are applying it today. I would put it that way. I told
Yes, sir.
you, the
Yes.
principle same, I told you, that punishment cannot be given, but procedure today you are applying the procedure, so it cannot be called as retrospective.
So what about then punishment?
Punishment cannot be greater than that. What could have been awarded when you committed the offense?
Yes, sir.
100%
Okay.
it cannot be. 100% it cannot be. But I have not seen why it goes to Sessions Court. What is the amendment, you tell me? Hello?
Sir.
Can you read out the amendment? Tell me why it goes to Session Court. I want to know.
I have no recent, sir, Bear Act.
Even I don't have.
Okay. Sir, I'll see, sir. I'll see. Thank you so
So
much, Lordship.
It should not go before the Sessions Court, according to me, unless the schedule is amended. Schedule is amended and it is made triable by Sessions Court. Which
Okay.
going by the punishment, if they have made it life imprisonment, then it is possible that it will go to Sessions Court. But if that was not the punishment when the offense was committed, then definitely you can't be punished with that. As far as forum is concerned, I can't comment, because that, as I told you, forum that is being purely procedural, you can't object to its application today when this act is in force. And secondly, I will tell you, trial by Sessions Court, in some other cases the dispute had arisen, because you will know that it's not like that the Session Court cannot try an offense of theft. They can try lower offense also. That is why the CRPC uses the word exclusively triable by Court of Sessions. So Session Court can try technically all offences if there are cases committed to them, if the Court of Session. So one cannot claim any prejudice just because he is being tried by the Court of Sessions. So therefore,
Sir.
that will be possible if that amendment has been effected. But I have not seen how it will go to Court of Session. Yes.
Sir, amendment has been affected as it has been made, schedule has been amended and
Huh.
trial has been allowed to the by Court of Sessions as far as 353 is concerned by the 2018 amendment. Therefore, the matters have been committed to the Court of Session.
But in that case, the Session Court cannot impose greater punishment. If the
No,
offence
punishment won't be greater, but the magistrate won't have powers to try, in my view. Therefore, since it is now exclusively triable by the Court of Sessions.
yeah, it is. If the punishment is more, what is the punishment?
Sir, punishment is 5 years, but the offense is made exclusively triable by the Court of Sessions.
But by the schedule, by amending the schedule.
Yes, sir, by amending the schedule.
That was my question. No, then that court has to try. Session Court has
Yes,
to
sir.
try.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, I have a question. Can I ask?
Yes.
A accused is providing two surety for fulfilling his bail conditions, and out of that two surety, one is rejected by police. So it would be a ground of cancellation of bail.
I don't understand what you say because the police have no power. Police can go to the
No,
magistrate.
A person is granted a bail, and the condition was to provide a two surety.
Yes.
So that
he
accused-
furnished two sureties, no?
He furnished two surety, and one surety was found fake by police
Later on,
later on.
a person was released after executing bail bonds by both the sureties.
Yes, everything is done. And after 2-3 months, police found that one surety is not suitable.
Yes.
So it would be a ground of cancellation of bail.
No, but after that, what did they do? They reported to the magistrate.
That was, I'm not sure if they have reported
But
the magistrate.
then what is the police? Just because the police have found automatically bail will not be cancelled. It is granted by a magistrate or session court, no?
Okay, so what
So
is
they
the
will have to, the proper course for the police will be to report the matter to the court granting bail, means magistrate or session court, whatever. And if they can ask for cancellation of bail. And it is for the magistrate to decide whether to give an opportunity to the accused to furnish another surety
Okay,
instead of that, or to take him in custody till he furnishes that surety.
okay.
Or he
Or
can, if he comes to the conclusion that he has acted fraudulently and therefore doesn't deserve to be released on bail, then the third course will be to cancel the bail order itself. You must understand the difference between cancellation of bail order and rejection of a surety. If surety is
Okay.
rejected also, he will remain inside, but only till another surety is furnished. The bail order will remain.
okay,
Only
sir.
these bail bonds will be cancelled, so you can furnish another surety. But the magistrate, if he feels that the accused has acted fraudulently, then he may cancel the bail order also. But in either case, the police cannot do anything except reporting the matter to the magistrate, where the magistrate is duty bound to hear the accused before he takes any action against the accused.
So magistrate will give notification to the accused before cancelling the order, something like.
He has to give. How
Okay,
can he automatically cancel? Because
Okay.
one doesn't know whether the police report is correct or not. And secondly, the accused may not have personal knowledge behind the furnishing the sureties. Many times the sureties are arranged by some well-wishers.
okay, right.
So who has done the fraudulent thing, that will have to be seen. And if the magistrate cancels without notice, then accused should argue that this cannot be done and we should be heard and put forth the points in favor of the accused.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Okay.
Sanjay
नमस्कार
Mhatre, sir.
नमस्कार मी ॲडव्होकेट संजय म्हात्रे, सेक्रेटरी ठाणे जिल्हा वकील संघटना. आज आपल्याला ठाणे जिल्हा वकील संघटनेकरिता माननीय ऑनरेबल जस्टिस ठिपसे साहेब यांनी जे लेक्चर दिलं, अतिशय महत्वाचं आणि मार्गदर्शनपर होतं. विषय खूप मोठा होता, पण त्यातही त्यांनी त्यांच्या पद्धतीने अतिशय सोप्या भाषेत आपल्याला हे सगळे विषय समजावून सांगितला. अजून एखादं लेक्चर त्यांचं मिळायला हवं असं नक्कीच संघटनेला वाटतं. मग सुरुवातीलाच आपल्याकडे माझी सहकारी रुपाली शिंदे यांनी सांगितलं की आम्ही आतापर्यंत लेक्चर्स घेतली, यापुढेही लेक्चर्स आपण चालू ठेवूया आणि साहेबांनी दिलेल्या अतिशय माहितीपूर्ण असे ह्या लेक्चर बद्दल त्यांचे आभार. आपण उपस्थित राहून हे लेक्चर अटेंड केलं त्याबद्दल आपलेही आभार आणि सर्व सदस्यांचे आभार. तसेच माझी सर्व सहकारी ज्यांनी हे लेक्चर सिरीज यशस्वी करण्यासाठी मदत आणि सहकार्य केलं त्या सर्वांचे आभार. पुन्हा एकदा संदीप डोंगरे यांनी ह्या संपूर्ण लेक्चर सिरीजसाठी जी मेहनत घेतली आणि त्यासाठी वारघडे वकील साहेबांनी जी काही सहकार्य केलं त्याबद्दल त्यांचेही आभार. नमस्कार. हेच लेक्चर संपले असं मी जाहीर करतो.